What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a new player's guide for Divinity Original Sin, the first in the Original Sin titles to be a little more specific, because following the announcement of Larian's upcoming game titled simply Divinity, there's been a lot of renewed interest in the franchise as a whole, which is actually already 6 games deep. And for somebody like myself who has been digging down that rabbit hole a long time, this is obviously really big news, but for the people playing these games for the first time, they're looking for a decent place to start, and that's kind of the aim of these videos. Now, I've already made one of these guides for Divinity Original Sin 2, mostly because that game's systems are more refined. It's probably the simplest place to jump in because story-wise, and if you're asking yourself whether or not you need to play Divinity Original Sin, the answer is simply no. If you're just looking to get informed about their upcoming release, you really only need to play Divinity Original Sin 2 for that, and story-wise, the reasoning is that Original Sin takes place roughly 1200 years or so before Divinity Original Sin 2. Like 1250 if you want to get specific about it. Which means that story-wise, outside of some recurring characters, there's not much that gets directly imported into the sequel, and combine that with some story framing devices that make it hard to take anything this particular game says literally in terms of its story. Again, if you wonder if you need to play this one, the answer is simply no. But a different question about whether or not you should play Divinity Original Sin, well, that's a little bit different. I think most people should play it because it is a fun game all on its own. And it's also fun to see how some of the systems have evolved, because one of the main things you'll notice about this game is that these systems are very similar to Original Sin 2's systems, but those are ultimately more refined, and you can kind of see where they made those decisions at. Which is honestly kind of funny, because most of what they did is make the system much more simple in comparison, especially around the physical and magical armor system. However, before we dive fully in here, probably worth a mention that if you are going to play Divinity Original Sin, it is likely in your library as 2 different entries, Divinity Original Sin and Divinity Original Sin Enhanced Edition. I'm obviously going to be covering the Enhanced Edition as that's kind of the definitive one these days, but you can still play that original version, and it does actually work a bit differently, so, be aware. Otherwise, let's talk difficulty of this game. So, not unlike Original Sin 2, we've got basically easy, normal, and hard, or Explorer, Classic, and Tactician if you prefer, followed by Honor Mode. Honor Mode is Tactician mode, but you only get 1 save. If the party goes down, that gets wiped, and you are out of luck. And while some of that might sound a little intimidating at first, in fact, it's really not. And the reasoning for that is that Original Sin has an incredibly easy speed run. Even if you don't really speedrun games, once you're decently familiar with this game after you've played it once and say you want to get the Honor Mode achievement, it's actually really easy to do the speedrun for this, which takes maybe 45 minutes. If you're going slow and literally just trying to finish it up for Honor Mode as an example. And I mention that because, like many of Larian's games, this is an incredibly cheesy one. In fact, some of the cheese here was addressed in later entries and made at least a little more difficult. It is incredibly easy to exploit this game, which makes even something like Honor Mode actually pretty trivial. However, let's assume you want to play the game the appropriate way, let's put it. Maybe rather than watching my 2.5-hour story breakdown, you'd like to simply experience that story. Well, fair enough. Let's actually dive into the rest of this then. Starting with, naturally, character creation, where we're going to learn a lot of information, but first and foremost, in this game you technically play 2 main characters. By default, they are Scarlet and Roderick. They don't have to be, you can swap them up if you want to have it be 2 men, 2 women, whatever else floats your boat. These guys are fully customizable, but you do have 2 protagonists. And on a really simple level, you could just, pick a name, pick a class preset, and pretty much be good to go. You can actually start the game easy peasy, simple as that. However, there's a lot more to know here. For starters, if you want to customize their appearance, that can be done via the Customize button. But first, let's talk about these class presets. Class presets are just that, a preset. Much like Original Sin 2, they are not binding. In fact, the game mostly uses a classless system. And so honestly, these class presets are, an easy way to get started immediately if you just want to play on Explorer mode, but really you're probably going to want to customize things. However, compared to Original Sin 2, there's a lot of numbers here. But once we hit that customize button, we can get into that a little bit. So the main things to know are your attributes, followed on by your many different types of abilities, which can be broken down into things like weapons, defense, skills, personality, craftsmanship, and nasty deeds, alongside talents. Now, Original Sin 2 takes a significant chunk of of this and basically just rolled it into the physical and magical armor systems over there. For instance, that is not present here, and we only have a health bar in combat. This is because the way status effects are applied here is a percentage chance of the ability you are using, then rolled against the enemy's defense against those things. So Original Sin 2, you have physical and magical armor. As long as that armor is there and hasn't been chewed through by the enemy, you will resist whatever status effect affects one of those two things. In Original Sin, however, instead of physical and magical armor, you have bodybuilding and willpower defense stats. When you or the enemy attack with an ability that would apply a status effect, it is typically based off a few different factors how much of a percentage chance there is of it working at all, but just as a baseline. And then once you actually use that ability, it is sort of rolled against, if you will, the enemy's defense, be that bodybuilding for physical or willpower for magical effects, and that determines whether or not the status is successful or not. And that is important because the actual combat strategy from Original Sin 2 hasn't changed much. We basically want to flood the action economy, and while at the same time just steal turns from the enemy by, say, knocking them down or using status effects that take their turns away. So it's important to understand how to apply those straight away. Another thing before we get into specifics here is that outside of the initial investment, you need an increasing amount of ability points to increase these things further. Like a skill point of 5 in any of these is actually really good and probably in-game level for the vast majority of stuff. It can go a little higher, especially with like gear and stuff, but that's about as much as you're going to put into them, and that is actually going to require you to save up ability points from like level ups and things, so you won't necessarily always be spending every point you have available to you at once. But otherwise, let's get into it, starting with the abilities side of things. So an important thing to understand here is how they interact with your attributes. In fact, your attributes are most of what determine like how much damage you deal with various things. Skills typically allow you to use more abilities from that type of skill, and then weapons usually do things like increase critical chance, remove penalties if you're dual wielding, or for stuff like single-handed will it actually increase damage. But basically be aware of, if you are putting points into the weapon skills, of what that is actually doing for you. Because for both weapons and skills, a lot of your damage actually comes from your attributes, which is important to know. So with a general spread of how you can get up to like about level 20 if you actually do everything, but more likely you're going to stop at like level 19, you should wind up having enough ability points to put things into like a single weapon, up to 2 defense stats, your main skill type, and then maybe like one extra thing for personality, craftsmanship, or nasty deeds. But even with a 4-man party, it's hard to cover all of this. And while you will eventually be able to respec your characters and even move some of these points around, that comes much later in the game. So you'll want to at least understand how some of this stuff works before you ultimately get started. Now, let's talk a bit about these defense stats. So you've got armor specialist, bodybuilding, shield specialist, and willpower. We've already talked about what bodybuilding and willpower do, so let's talk about armor specialist. Armor specialist basically gives you more armor rating, or that is to say you take less percentage damage from physical attacks, alongside reducing the movement penalty from wearing heavier armor. If you are wanting like a big melee fighter, armor specialist is pretty important, and you're probably going to combine that with like bodybuilding to make them pretty resistant to upfront and close combat. Whereas shield specialist basically just gives you more chance to actually block attacks with a shield if you have one equipped. So if you combine that with single-handed weapons, obviously that's a pretty decent way to go. But I'm more of a fan of two-handers in this game myself. From there, we've got the individual skills. Now, there's a lot less of these overall, I would say, than Original Sin 2, mainly because a lot of the stuff that they kind of separate out in that game are not present here. For instance, summoning is still a big thing in this game. It's just that you have summons spread across a lot of these different skills, as opposed to being in like one central place with the summoning skill. Primarily, there are a couple of others that you can get even in Original Sin 2, but my point is, can you make a summoner? Yes. It's just a little more complicated because the summons are in different places. Man-at-Arms is effectively your warfare skill. It still has a lot of your important physical status effect granting abilities, that is to say knocking enemies down a lot. Scoundrel changes very little from this game to the next, emphasizing getting behind enemies and just tearing through their life. And then of course your various elemental skills. But the way all of these works, regardless of what they actually do for you, is important to understand because points in these skills doesn't make you better at the skills themselves. The damage typically comes from your attributes. What putting points in these skills in character creation and later on during level ups will actually do for you is allow you to use more of those skills at higher levels. So, for instance, at level 1 here, you can know 3 novice skills of any of these, and then as you put points into them, you'll eventually be able to access more adept and master level skills. Now, this is actually really important because there is stuff like Aerotheurge in particular that actually has really basic level skills that you don't necessarily need a high point investment to use, like teleportation. So you don't necessarily always need like a big point investment into these skills to make great use of them. Teleportation probably simply being the easiest example of that, because while we do get teleport pyramids in this one, which allow us to teleport characters around and teleport to places, that kind of thing, we don't get a handy item like in Original Sin 2 that just gives us the skill, and so a single point in Aerotheurge will give you teleportation. If you go learn the skill, mind you. You do have to still buy the skills, you won't just know them automatically, which is also something to know. And probably important to mention that when you do finally get access to the ability to respec these characters, they will forget the skills they know, meaning that you'll have to spend gold to relearn those skills, which is kind of, in addition to the upfront cost, the other side of it. Then we've got your personality skills. Some of these are very straightforward, like bartering, just giving you better prices. Charisma is a little bit different because charisma determines things like charming, intimidate, and reasoning in conversation. The way skill checks for this work in this game is that there's like a roll of your charisma versus the person you're trying to persuade's charisma and like what the situation is. It's like a whole tiny little mini game in the form of like rock, paper, scissors, but intimidate, charm, or reason in this particular one, and charisma just makes this easier. However, with that in mind, like most things, you don't need a full investment. You can actually win every single conversation thing like that with 2 points in charisma. You don't need to take it farther. Then there is leadership. Leadership is usually useful to have on at least one person, and that is because it gives extra initiative and damage to the people around you, which can start off relatively small but can lead into some bigger bonuses later. And basically, as long as your leader is in sight, everyone around them gets those bonuses. That can actually be pretty strong if you lean into it, but is more of a late game thing. And then there is Lucky Charm. Lucky Charm allows you to both find extra treasure, yes, but it also improves your offense rating. Offense rating is basically what you need to actually hit things. Then we have our craftsmanship abilities. So blacksmithing and crafting are what you are going to need to craft some stuff. Crafting plays a role in this game just like it does in Original Sin 2. And while you don't necessarily need to go all in on crafting, it will help you do things like make higher quality crafted stuff. Now, most of the actual crafting requires relatively low crafting investment. Where you're going to actually see the highest level requirements is what they call enchanting. So enchanting is not all that different from crafting in that you take a piece of equipment and, combine it with various stuff. Leather scraps, just use it on an anvil, that kind of thing, and you can improve and, add stuff to that item specifically. Those particular interactions typically require a much higher crafting requirement, potentially up to that late game of 5. So crafting can be useful, but it does require much more meta knowledge to get the most out of, so that's certainly something to know. But then we also have Lore Master and Telekinesis. Lore Master is your ability to identify the items that come into your inventory, which is important, of course. You don't have to go pay to get them identified for yourself. It also lets you examine enemies for resistances and weaknesses and the like, so you're likely going to want at least one Lore Master in the party simply so you can identify all of these different items. But then we have the most broken by far, and that is Telekinesis. Telekinesis is used in basically all of the cheese for this game because it lets you move an item from a distance regardless of your carry weight. The more points in telekinesis you have, the farther you can move heavier items. However, even with a single point of telekinesis, you can usually still make use of this, and I would say its primary use, more than anything else, is giving you the ability to make use of an exploit revolving weight in containers. Basically, the easiest way to kill almost everything in this game is to throw a bunch of 60-pound barrels into a chest, and then use telekinesis to set that chest on top of enemies, which will deal roughly 1 point of damage per point of weight, and once you get that chest up to like 3,000-4,000 pounds, you can kill everything in a couple of hits. A very fun little exploit. And then last but not least, we've got the nasty deeds section. Lockpicking, pickpocketing, and sneaking, of course. So lockpicking lets you pick higher and higher locks, pickpocketing lets you steal from people, and sneaking, of course, makes it easier to sneak around enemies. These are situational. There are times in the game where these are really, really useful, but at the same time, they're not really necessary either. Like, for instance, there are parts where you're going to have to sneak past some unkillable enemies, and sneaking's actually pretty useful in that particular scenario, but it doesn't come up a ton otherwise, unless you just want to try to get like a sneak attack, but that's not even necessary thanks to other exploits. But personally, I don't really enjoy putting points into lockpicking because you can get them through items, as an example, and then some simple locks you don't even need point investment at all. But oftentimes you can just break doors down at the same time, so the nasty deed stuff is very situational. But from there, let's move on to attributes. So, as I mentioned earlier, attributes are very important because they are where a lot of our scaling comes from. And it's important to understand what they do. Strength, dexterity, and intelligence are typically going to be what things scale damage off of. For instance, strength will determine our offense rating for strength-based weapons, meaning our chance to hit essentially. It also improves man-at-arms skills, how much we can carry, and how far you can chuck them even. But if you use telekinesis, you can bypass that entirely. Then you have stuff like dexterity. Dexterity is how good you can hit things with dexterity-based weapons, and of course improves things like marksman, scoundrel, and even gives you a little bit of defense rating. Intelligence does much the same, but for elemental abilities and witchcraft. Constitution is, unsurprisingly, your vitality, but it also influences your max number of action points. Everybody wants a little bit of Constitution in most cases. Same with speed, because speed increases your movement speed, or how far you can move per action point, your initiative, as well as how many action points you gain per turn, allowing you to take more actions. So everybody wants a little bit of speed. And then finally, perception, which affects things like critical chance, initiative, your starting action points in combat, your ability to detect traps, and accuracy when using like bows and the like. So you'll likely want at least one character with high perception, if only to, see things like traps and the like. So that's a rough breakdown of how all of that works, and then you'll pick your 3 starting skills based on the abilities that you put your skill points into, and that's going to determine your preset for character creation, with the rest of it going on from there. Now, loading up my old save to show you guys the builds that I've beaten a tactician with. For instance, my main guy Roderick here had dual wielding at 5 because I liked to dual wield with him, of course, but I also put a single point into Aerothurge so I could use things like the stunning abilities as well as teleport from that, and the rest was into man-at-arms. For defense, I put it into armor specialist and bodybuilding to make sure that while he was up front and personal with enemies, they were not taking him out via things like status effects and the like, and then he also had some other points and things just via his gear. Whereas for Scarlet, I was primarily using bows and stuff, so high dexterity, expert marksman, the bow weapon skill obviously, but she also had some points in Hydra Sophist as well, so I could use her to heal or potentially freeze enemies and the like. Whereas Medora, one of the potential companions you could have, I had just a pure melee warrior, all strength, all man-at-arms, up front and personal with enemies. And then another one, Bear Doter, was primarily an archer, but with a little bit of summoning and things via Geomancer to make her just a little more annoying. Now, while I was scrolling through those, you may have seen one thing that was not actually in character creation, and that was the Tenebrium weapons. So Tenebrium is a special substance that you will come into contact with via the main story, and it can be added on to weapons, and in order to make the most use of those, you're going to have to put points into the Tenebrium weapon skill, though I would not generally worry about it too much, just so you know. Now, another interesting thing is that we also have personality traits. So as you play through the game and start interacting with people and having conversations and stuff, it will put you towards one side of different personality traits via conversations. These, depending on which side of them you are on, give you the according bonuses. Like, for instance, being romantic will give you 1 point into the Lucky Charm skill, as an example. So you will get bonuses based on your character's personalities and how you're interacting in conversations. Then we've also got your talents. So you can pick some talents right at character creation, mind you, but these are once again similar but different from Divinity Original Sin 2. Stuff like Pet Pal is still really great because it will let you talk to the various pets, will get you access to a lot of content as a result, with the rest being a bit more situational based on how you want to build that character. If you want to make attacks of opportunity in melee, you're going to want the Opportunist trait. If you want to just play with Scarlet and Roderick, you can pick up Lone Wolf and just take those two. If you want to heal from poison and damage from regular healing, you can pick up Zombie, which is kind of like being an undead in Original Sin 2. So more often than not, these are again similar but different than those. However, what you want really just kind of depends on the character you're building more than anything else. However, some of them are advantages at a disadvantage, like for instance getting increases in one thing to take a decrease in another. But in terms of what you actually want, it really just depends on the, again, type of character you're building there. Most of it's pretty self-explanatory. You'll get talents every few levels, and they can be pretty good for you. Now, the other part of building a character I want to mention is gear. So much in the way Divinity Original Sin 2 handles it, we kind of see that same item scaling here. Items are based on the level that you pick them up typically, but there is a little bit of variance there based on like where you got it and stuff. However, items have a level requirement. Every level you are under that level requirement, or attribute requirement, etc., whatever it might be, you are going to have penalties to using it, especially in terms of what it costs to use it. There are also unique items, some of which stay useful, like the Death Knight Control Wand is a big part of the story. Others just have useful effects or add useful abilities to you, that kind of thing. But, ultimately, if it has a set level and you're passing it up, it will eventually be surpassed in stats by other more regular things. But the nice thing about the unique items is if you know where to find them, even though they are set levels, they do at least have set stats, which makes them a little easier to plan around in comparison to the random stuff that gets rolled when you identify it. Now, in addition to that and the penalties, however, you also have to pay attention to durability, which is a thing here. Obviously, if your items hit 0 durability, they become effectively useless, and you'll need to get it repaired, which is something you can do yourself via things like, say, blacksmithing. Though, truth be told, you're going to be burning through equipment so fast and swapping it out constantly. I've pretty much never worn something down to 0, but just so you know. And then last off, before we leave the gear section here, there are the adventurer's items. So throughout the game, you can find upgradable items, basically, that are these base adventurer items, and then you can find kits to upgrade them with, and they get stronger as you go, and they can result in some really strong items towards the end of the game. And if you want to keep, one weapon more or less as you move through it, those can be a really good option for you, but the thing there is you have to find the base item, you got to find all its upgrades, you got to make sure that you are actually the level at which the upgrade will need you to be to use it effectively, that kind of thing. Now, moving on from there, let's go ahead and start talking about some general tips for Divinity Original Sin. Probably the first and biggest one I want to make very clear is that levels are extremely important in this one. Ideally, you really don't want to fight anything that's even a single level above you. Now, unfortunately, this also means that while the game itself is comprised of 3 different main area maps and then a 4th sort of sub-area, those being Seal, the Luculla Forest, and the Phantom Forest, you actually want to tackle these in a pretty specific way. Essentially, so you can stay on level curve if you are not actively making use of exploits. It is not impossible to get around this, but they're very much, because of the way the sort of level curve is spaced out throughout the game, is kind of like an ideal way to move through it. And to that end, I wanted to share some of these level maps that I have used extensively, but I did not personally make them. You can find these over on Steam. They were created by a user named Tamas, I'm not sure, Tamas. I can vouch for the fact that they work very well and are accurate. This is actually one of the bigger tips I could give you, because while I wouldn't say any of the combat encounters are especially difficult, even on Tactician, or if you're willing to make use of an exploit here or there to speed things up, that kind of thing, if you are on level curve and you have well put together characters, most of this shouldn't be too much of an issue, and thanks to these maps, it makes it relatively easy to do that. Divinity Original Sin 2 also kinda sorta has this problem, but it is much, much more prominent here. You really do ideally want to follow this and, take on the quests that take you to these areas in these orders, or you may very well find yourself with a problem. Following on from that, there are also your companions. So Original Sin has, in addition to your main 2 characters, 4 potential companions, but you can only take 2 of them with you. You can, to be clear, actually take all of them into your party, but you have to dismiss them. And you can only travel with 4 people total at a time. Now, it is possible to hire henchmen as well if you want to use just generic characters, but these 4 companion characters have full-blown stories attached to them. Medora's is notoriously annoying because she has points from how you talk to her in various conversations throughout the entirety of the game, and to get the ending that you want for her, it's a bit of a pain. But there's also Jahan, Beardoter, and Wolgraf. You'll pick these guys up pretty much right at the beginning of the game in the town there, and you're probably going to want to do that to fill out your party to make some of those fights easier, again, just through sheer action economy. But now that I've got those guys mentioned, now is probably a good time to mention the End of Time, or the Homestead, as it might be called. So basically, throughout Original Sin, as part of the main story, you're going to come into contact with Starstones or Bloodstones. When you do, especially the first one, you'll be transported to the Homestead. This is effectively going to act as like your camp or your character hub throughout the game. This is important for a variety of different reasons to the story, yes, but it's also where you're going to get a lot of access to features that help you do things. For instance, the first one you'll unlock is the Observatory, which is going to give you access to the teleporter pyramids. After that, you're going to get access to the Hall of Heroes, which when you dismiss your companions and stuff, that's where they'll go to wait on you. Later on, you'll get access to like a storage chamber. You'll be able to change your appearance or respec your characters later. You'll eventually get access to vendors that sell all of the important skills and stuff in here. The End of Time is expanded by finding more and more Starstones and Bloodstones, which gives you access to more and more of it, which is how you get access to all of these convenience features. That's important to understand because once you get it all filled out, it puts everything you want kind of in one central location. But I did mention the teleporter pyramids there, so very early on you'll gain access to the red teleporter pyramid, and upon using it, it will teleport you, as it is supposed to the blue teleporter pyramid, at which point you can use them. And there's also a funny interaction when you do that. But for those unaware, the teleporter pyramids have been in the Divinity games since the very beginning. Literally the first one, Divine Divinity, had them. And whoever is in possession of one teleporter pyramid can teleport to the location of the other one, and vice versa. Now, you can use these from a character's inventory, yes, and they'll take everybody chained to them in terms of your character group as well or you can say set them in certain locations, or using things like telekinesis, throw them and gain access to areas that you should not otherwise be in, that kind of thing. There's a variety of different stuff you can do with the teleporter pyramids, and you should ideally make good use of them in that regard. Now, some other general tips though. Some stuff is only going to be available to you via the story, like the ability to kill the Death Knights. So roughly in the middle of the second act, give or take, the Lucula Forest, you're going to eventually encounter Death Knights. Death Knights are unkillable until you gain access to the means to kill them via the story. Until you have that, they have a status effect called Invulnerable, and it is exactly that. Nothing you can do will kill these guys. There is no way around this, other than going around them. So you're going to have to stealth past certain sections that are kind of crawling with Death Knights. This is easier in some places. It's not impossible by any means, and they have intentionally made it to where even if you don't have like a stealth-focused character, it's not impossible, but it can be a little bit annoying, and you should definitely watch out for those guys as you play through this game. Now, in basically every other instance, as I mentioned much earlier, you can make use of that chest exploit if you're having trouble with a particular encounter or stuff like that, but even that comes with a slight caveat. So the chest exploit, basically take a chest, put a bunch of really heavy stuff in it until that chest weighs several thousand pounds, and then use telekinesis to hit enemies with it, essentially setting it in their general vicinity in an effort to do damage. It will one-shot most things in the game. It is very strong, and in fact, you're going to use the teleporter pyramids to make the most use of it, because the character in possession of that chest likely can't move because of how heavy it is, but you can use teleporter pyramids to just move them where you need them to be. And then they can use telekinesis in the chest to go from there. Now, the catch to this is, and the thing that I wanted to point out, is that it oftentimes won't work in interior cells. Now, lucky for us, most of the game is considered an exterior cell, even if you are literally inside a building. However, there are certain maps on occasion that are like caves and stuff. This chest exploit doesn't actually work in there for some reason. I'm not exactly sure on the why, but you'll find this very difficult to pull off in places like caves, or basically anywhere that is a single map that is an interior of somewhere. But it will work like 99% of the time, and if you're absolutely stuck on something, is, something you can keep in your back pocket to ensure progress. Which finally brings us to combat. So combat is interesting in comparison to Divinity Original Sin 2 because a lot of the core tenets are the same. Basically, you want to make use of the action economy. You want to take as many actions as possible via things like your summons, etc., while also taking as many turns away from the enemy as possible. If you stick to that philosophy, you'll probably be okay 99% of the time, as long as you're on level curve. However, how you go about doing that is a bit different because of the way stats and things are different from Original Sin 2. First, you got to talk about your offense and defense rating. They are your ability to hit with or evade non-magical attacks, basically the physical stuff coming your way. Obviously, the higher the better there. However, because it mentions non-magical, it's not always super important to every single character. Like if I'm using Jahan typically as my mage type character, him having a super high offense rating isn't necessary in most cases. But on top of just that, you also have your armor rating. Armor is the percentage of the incoming physical damage that you will reduce. So here on Roderick, I've got 259 armor rating, and what that actually equates to is that the physical attacks that do hit me are going to take 44% reduction of characters versus my own level. You then also have for your actual elemental attacks that are coming your way, your resistances. That's the damage reduction against those things that are hitting you. And do keep in mind, speaking of those resistances, that much like Original Sin 2, this game had a big emphasis on its environmental and elemental interactions. And while everything is not perpetually on fire the way it is in Original Sin 2, that stuff does come into play here. And, being able to set oil on fire or raining things down to then electrocute the water pools, that is absolutely stuff you can do and play around with here, but it is a little more rudimentary than Original Sin 2's versions. Another thing to know, they kind of compressed things like action points in the sequel as well. So in this game we have a lot more action points, but things also cost more action points as well. Like generally an attack is going to cost you 4 in comparison to 2 in Original Sin 2. But the core premise is basically the same. Use the action points available to you to move and attack accordingly, which means if you can do this stuff without moving, ideally you would get more points to do so, and abilities that allow you to traverse and also attack are particularly high value, like Battering Ram as an example, because then you can position your melee character while also potentially knocking down enemies, and that's always going to be pretty useful. However, as I also mentioned much earlier, this game does not use the magic and physical armor system of its sequel, and that means all of your chances at status effects and the like are not deterministic. They are chance-based on a variety of different factors, including a saving throw on their end from their bodybuilding or willpower stat appropriately. This is why it's important to bulk up your characters in the appropriate way so that when I use a melee character to do things like use Battering Ram and try to knock enemies down, that knockdown is actually successful. Beyond that, another thing to know is that while this will typically be the case just in the way you build your characters, having a high attribute that is related to the skills you are actually using will reduce their cooldowns, allowing you to make use of them more often in combat, which is obviously always going to be useful. But speaking of cooldowns, it's probably important to understand cooldown versus encounter-based abilities. Most of the abilities are cooldown-based. You can't use them for so many turns until they recharge, basically. However, there are some abilities that are encounter-based. You can only use them once per combat, basically. Those are pretty rare, but they do come up occasionally, so probably something you would want to know. Otherwise, all of that said, combat itself is really straightforward. You're basically just going to try to stun lock enemies as well as you can, while also pumping up your own team via things like summons and the like to make sure you are taking as many turns as possible. That simple strategy, along with staying on the level curve, can easily get you all the way through Tactician on this one, especially if you're willing to use that chest exploit to manage some of the more difficult bosses if you get stuck or something like that. So in that way, I think Original Sin is actually really interesting in the sense that I think there are parts of it that can be harder to understand than Original Sin 2, but it's also kind of a simpler system at the same time, in the sense that a lot of the combat encounters aren't as over the top as they can be in Original Sin 2. And off the top of my head, the only 2 fights in Original Sin 1 here that I think can be especially challenging no matter what are the fight with Brachus Rex, because he can potentially summon in a bunch of bosses to help him, and he has an opening salvo that is really strong. And then the final fight against the Void Dragon can be tough because it has a lot of enemies that are difficult to pin down. But I think as far as advice for new players go, that is pretty much going to wrap it up in terms of this new player's guide. So hopefully you found all of that useful, but I don't pretend to be a monolith of knowledge here either. If there's anything specific you would like to drop down in the comment section below, by all means feel free to do so. I'm sure anybody watching this video would probably appreciate the tips and advice, but for me, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.